We will get started in just a few moments. We're going to let everyone join the meeting. And we'll wait just one more minute to get everyone into the meeting here. Lots of people still connecting. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us here for this first series of the Science Lab. I'm Roger Woodard. I am a teaching professor in applied and computational mathematics and statistics. I'm also the director of our online master's program in data science here at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm delighted to be here with each of you today and to share how data science and algorithms work in our lives. I want to start off by thanking our partners in this effort, the College of Science, the Lucy Institute for Data and Society, the Technology Ethics Center in the Law School, and of course, the Notre Dame Alumni Association. So thank you to all of those partners for helping us bring this program to life. To start the conversation, I'd like to welcome a couple of distinguished guests who are going to be speaking with us today. We've got my colleague from the Department of ACMS and the director of the Children's Environmental Health Initiative, and also our provost, Miserably Miranda. We also have our colleague from the College of Engineering, Kevin Boyer, who's the Schubmel Priem Professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering. So welcome to Mari-Lynn and Kevin. And Mari-Lynn, let's start with you. Welcome to ThinkND and the Science Lab.
Thank you for doing this.
We are sharing your bio through the ThinkND site and also in the chat. And I want to highlight just a couple of things that are in your email signature. And probably the first one there is that you're the director of the Children's Environmental Health Initiative. And this is an initiative you started down at Duke. And then as you've progressed through your career, you have carried that research group with you. You went up to that school up north in Ann Arbor that we won't mention too much about. And then you also took that with you down to Rice. And now we've got it here at Notre Dame.
That's right.
Those of us that know about that realize how important this research is. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Children's Environmental Health Initiative, or CEHI, C-E-H-I, is a research, education, and outreach program committed to fostering environments where all people can prosper. We have a particular interest in environmental and social justice problems as they affect children. Our technical bailiwick is in the spatial analysis of data. A number of the methods and techniques that we've developed and deploy are equally relevant for adult health endpoints. So if you look at our website, you'll see that we're working on any number of adult health endpoints. But the difference between those two projects is that when we originate or start something, it's always about pregnant women or children. When we are asked by other people to partner with them, that's when we get into adult health endpoints. So we have a particular focus on social and environmental justice, which means that we work predominantly in communities and with data from communities that are typically low socioeconomic status and predominantly minority. And our funding typically comes from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the NIH, although we've also had a variety of different foundations fund our work. Our topical areas, we're probably best known for the work that we've done on childhood lead exposure, but we've also worked on air pollution exposure, pesticide exposure, allergens and asthma triggers, PBDEs, which are these compounds that affect thyroid function. We're doing a little bit of work on PFAS, so a variety of different environmental exposures. And we're always interested in how those environmental exposures pile up in communities that also experience a lot of social stressors.
Fantastic. And as I said, this is, for those of us who have looked into this, this is extraordinarily important work. It is things that make a real difference in people's lives. So I commend you on that. You mentioned something that, as a data scientist, it perked my ears, spatial data and spatial analysis. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is and how that plays into the analysis of this kind of data?
Sure. So when I say that we specialize in spatial analysis of data, really important, the sort of bedrock component of that is for each piece of data that we collect, we attach a spatial location to it. So if you have test scores from, early elementary education, well, we figure out where those kids live and we attach a spatial location to it. So for every piece of data we collect, we attach a spatial location to it. And that allows you to create these spatial surfaces, right? And the fact that you have spatial reference on one data set means that you can use shared geography to sort of pierce together different data sets that previously have never been able to be combined. And the way that you pierce them together is through shared geography. So we have all kinds of different spatial data layers that we create, and then we kind of align them with each other by finding, like, here's a spine of a shared common geographic location, here's another spine with a shared geographic location, here's another spine. So if you can imagine, we have these surfaces, a couple of them, you put enough spines through it, then the surfaces kind of all align themselves. That allows us to create these geospatial data architectures. We actually tend to create both geospatial and geospatio-temporal architecture. So you see how all of those surfaces change and get pierced together over time as well. I have to, while I'm talking, I have to give a huge shout out to Carolina Avendaño, who's my Director of Research Operations, who moved with me from Rice to here, and Joshua Toto, who's the Director of all of our Geographic Information Systems and Director of our training program, who moved from Duke to Michigan to Rice to Notre Dame. And that is not so much, doesn't say anything about me. What it says a lot about is the commitment that people have to the work that we're doing and the importance that people place on both the intellectually interesting things that we're doing, as well as the strong sense of being able to contribute something to the world.
Right. Yeah. And again, I commend you on that, and also your entire staff. That is, again, really important work. And it's something that really understanding how these things vary over, basically it's over a map, right? That's kind of the way we can think about this. We have maps of all these features, and by combining the different maps together, it helps us to understand what is going on with those.
Although an important thing is it's not just creating the maps, it's actually doing spatial analysis. So using spatial statistics to analyze those data, because there are a lot of things, we're used to seeing a lot of maps now. We have maps on our phone, we have maps everywhere, right? But the whole idea is that there are rigorous ways where you can evaluate the question, how are things in this map related to things in this map? And are these two, if I'm looking at this map in 2000 and this map in 2015, how can I evaluate where and why those maps are different? So there's this, it's not just the display of maps, it's the analysis of the data that underlie those maps. And then we subsequently almost always report or display the results of the analysis spatially in maps as well.
Sure. So in this process where you're correlating things spatially and thinking about how they come together, what are some of the myths or misconceptions that might come into play in this? Are there things that we should worry about when people are doing this kind of analysis?
Well, I think one of the critical questions when you do spatial analysis of data is to think really hard about the spatial resolution at which you should implement your analyses. So for a very long time in public health, there was no spatial component, or even in environmental health, there was no spatial component that was introduced. And of course, there's a lot of spatial autocorrelation that exists in all kinds of data. We're sort of used to thinking about temporal autocorrelation or other kinds of autocorrelation, but not really about spatial autocorrelation. So there were two sort of things going on. People tended to analyze data at the county level. Any of you, if you just think about that for a minute, think across St. Joe County and how different parts of St. Joe County are. And if you take all the data in St. Joe County and you average it, you lose a whole lot of information, and you average it before you combine it with other data, you lose a whole lot of information. So we never do work at the county level. We're almost always operating, sometimes we operate at the census tract or the zip code level. Oftentimes we're operating at the block group level. For certain projects like our childhood lead exposure project, we actually operate at the individual tax parcel level. So a tricky thing in spatial analysis of data is thinking about the problem and the geographic dimension over which that problem plays out. So with lead exposure, it plays out at the individual household level. With ozone exposure, that plays out over a much broader geographic area. So you need to sort of think hard about the problem and then match the geographic resolution at which you do your analysis to the nature of the problem that you're addressing.
Yeah, so I guess it's a fact that things like ozone exposure and things like that, those don't stop at the county line. They don't. Right. They don't read a road sign and say, "Hey, we don't go any farther than this." It spreads across that. So, just again, for our audience, you mentioned autocorrelation. Could you just say a little bit about what that is, and a little bit about what that, in kind of simple terms?
Sure. So I'll give an example from the work that we've done on childhood lead exposure. So if I just take every single house and I put it into my model that's trying to evaluate which houses are more or less likely to have biologically available lead in them, then I will end up ignoring the fact that, so there's a couple of things that are good predictors of, well, there are about 6 things that are the best predictors, but I'm going to pick 2 of them that are good predictors of biologically available lead. One of them is the age of the house, because the older the house is, the more likely it is going to have lead-based paint in it. And the other is the value of the house, and the value of the house because you're trying to figure out this question of what's worse, a house that was built in 1940, but that's really well kept up and there's additional layers of paint sealing things in, or a house that was built 20 years later where maybe there's not as much lead-based paint, but it's not being kept up as well, right? So you could, if you just put that data in, there would be all this spatial autocorrelation, meaning that, Roger, if you and I live next door to each other, chances are that our houses were built, at about the same time, because that's how neighborhoods develop, right? Mm-hmm. And also chances are, if you and I live next door to each other, if your house has a very high assessed tax value, which is one way to sort of get at how well kept up, how expensive, how fancy houses are, chances are that my house also has a high assessed tax value, except I'm probably not as good at taking care of my house as you are. But on average, that would be true. So if you don't pay attention to that, so you can do a couple of things. Number one, you can put in the actual age of housing and put in the actual assessed tax value to get rid of that spatial autocorrelation. In the absence of having data on how old a house is or what the assessed tax value, and you don't always have that data, you can do spatial analysis of the data and put in a spatial random variable. So we're always used to putting in sort of just your general error term, but here you put in a spatial error term, and one of the things you find out is how significant are those spatial error terms, which tell you a little something about some autocorrelation that you're missing. So it's usually not the space itself that's driving that's driving the result. It's something about the characteristic of the space. So you want to look at that, and if it turns out to be significant, then you kind of dig deep in and say, well, what is it about the characteristics of this space that's driving that spatial autocorrelation, and can I figure out how to create a different data set to address that? So in our childhood-led exposure work, for example, we worked with, we work with individual counties on this lead risk assessment model. We're working with St. Joe County right now to develop it for here, but we work with the health department to get the lead data, and then we work with the county tax office to get the tax assessor data, which typically has year built as well as assessed tax value, and then we marry all of these different data layers together.
Fantastic. Provost Miranda, I know that you have another appointment and your day is jam-packed, and we're basically at the end of the time that we can ask you more questions, but any parting thoughts, anything that you'd like to add before you have to jump off?
So again, I have a really nice team of about 10 who you know, they do the hard work of making sure that we stay on track with our program. I also want to say that keeping my research program is important to me. Keeping it going is important to me for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it's my safe, happy place. It's where I get to not work on COVID, although we actually have a COVID-19 registry. So I guess I'm working on COVID there too. But it's just very intellectually refreshing for me. The other reason, I can't stand to not have the questions we're working on answered. So it's important to me for any number of reasons. The other reason I really like to keep my research program going is because I feel like it helps me understand the daily lives of our faculty. So when the federal government puts in a new requirement of, something that you have to do, I have to do it too. When the Office of Research changes the way that you have to do your paperwork to submit a grant proposal, I have to do that too. So I'm walking that path with our faculty, and it helps me to understand better when are we doing things that are really faculty promoting, making the lives of our faculty easier, allowing our faculty to focus on deep thinking and deep work as opposed to administrivia. The last thing I'll say is that I just had a conversation earlier this week. I did this interview with Arvind Krishna, who's the CEO of IBM. He's kind of an old friend of mine. I mentored his son a little bit. But I really wish I could stay to hear Kevin talk about facial recognition technology, because of course, I just was talking to Arvind Krishna about the fact that IBM made a very deliberate ethics-based decision to withdraw from the facial recognition market and is calling for a national dialogue. So Kevin, I'm so sorry, but I can't wait and hear you talk, because I'm pretty sure you're going to be way more interesting than I am.
Well, I don't know if that's true, speaking for Kevin there, but
I don't know if that's true.
Provost Miranda, thank you again. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate the work you're doing in environmental health, and also the work you're doing here as a provost. So I think everyone agrees that this has been a great session. So thank you. Thanks
so much, everyone. Happy weekend. Bye. Have a weekend, okay? Everybody take time and have a weekend. See you later.
Bye-bye. So with that, well, we'll turn over to Kevin, who is going to talk to us. And Kevin, thank you for joining us here at ThinkND and Science Lab. We are also going to share your bio in the chat as well. And I think we'll dive right into some questions. One thing that I do want this to be, we do want this to be a conversation with Kevin, not just a presentation by the two of us. We would like you, the audience members, to also submit your questions. So we have a link to a Google form that is how we will collect those questions and put them all in a nice, easy spot for Kevin and I to take a look at. So as we're going through and talking about facial recognition and some of the things that are going on in Kevin's work, if you have questions, please do put those questions into the link, and we will try to get to those at the end of the session, and we will try to go through as many of them as we can. So just jumping right in, Kevin, your general area of work includes biometrics, And can you tell us what that involves and how long you've been doing research in this area? And feel free, you've got some slides, I think that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So biometrics is a simple concept to understand, and it's becoming more sort of ubiquitous everywhere. It's just the idea that we're going to measure something about a living entity in order to recognize the identity of that person. I've also consulted on a case where they were looking at racehorses and being moved around and wanted to make sure that they had the right racehorse, something like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about face recognition today. We're not going to say much at all about fingerprint or any of these others, but fingerprint is probably a privileged biometric modality in our legal system for historical sorts of reasons. Iris recognition is one of the biometric modalities that's come on strong in the last 20 years, viewed as very highly accurate, but without the legal history of fingerprint, without the number of people already having iris images acquired that have face images acquired. We were privileged in our lab to be able to help the emerging country of Somaliland do a demo project on iris recognition 4 or 5 years ago now, to figure out how to make a one person, one voter registration voting list for their presidential election. And that was something that we were able to do because of the Shubham chair that I hold. I put a picture of a signature here because signature is something that can be analyzed statically or dynamically. And when you say analyze the signature dynamically, you're looking at the speed and the pressure with which the various strokes in the signature are made. And there's a company called Signio that has sort of reimagined signature analysis for the touch-sensitive part of mobile devices. And it's out in Seattle, and it's populated with a good fraction of the employees are Notre Dame grads, both of engineering and Mendoza, and the founder is a Notre Dame dad. This picture indicating recognizing people by how they walk, recognition by gait, and this one indicating recognition by speech pattern, something that's also done. Gait is not as sort of recurring popularity every 10 years as a research topic, but hasn't cut through and hit the commercial market. You asked how long I've been doing this. So I've been in computer vision and pattern recognition all my academic career. I came to Notre Dame in 2001. I was at University of South Florida before, and while I was at University of South Florida, I had a large project in digital mammography, looking for signs of cancer in mammograms. And I had a small project, excuse me, while I was at USF in 3D face recognition because a colleague was at DARPA and he needed some work done to get something going that he wanted. And as I came to Notre Dame in fall of 2001, getting here in August, 9/11 happened in September. And that sort of created opportunities in the biometric space for federal funding for our government to try to come up to speed on all sorts of things. So I've been primarily devoted to biometrics research for the 20 years or so that I've been here at Notre Dame.
So facial recognition is kind of the buzzword that we're talking about a little bit here. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and how it's evolved over time, how it's moved through measuring points on a face? Is it like what we see on CSI and some of these TV shows, or is it different from that?
Well, all of us in biometrics think nothing is like what you see on CSI or any similar show. So we just start with that. It doesn't work quite as magically as that. Face recognition is actually really simple to understand at a high level. You're going to take a picture which contains the face, and you're going to generate a list of numbers. We call the list of numbers a feature vector. And when things got started, they were actually features that you could name. They were like the inner eye distance, the distance to the nose, the distance to the distinguished landmark points on the face. That disappeared in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years as the field moved to deep neural networks as a more powerful way of generating the feature vector. But if there's any magic sauce in face recognition, this is where it happens. When you get a picture of a face, you generate a feature vector. When you get a picture of another face, you generate a feature vector. You want to design the system so that all pictures from the same person generate a very similar feature vector, and all pictures from some other same person generate a different feature vector. Feature vector is about 500 numbers, maybe up to 2,000, depending on whose technology you're using nowadays. Once you have the feature vector for the image, things go pretty mechanically, pretty predictably. You compare the two feature vectors to say, how similar are these? You're hoping to find out how similar is the appearance of the face in the two images. And then you're going to, based on the level of similarity, make some decision. Are these two pictures pictures of the same person, or are these two pictures pictures of a different person? In other words, are they a match or are they a non-match? When you use the system in application, you know that when you get pairs of pictures of the same person, they may have different lighting, they may have different facial expression. You can see some evidence of both of those. You don't see much evidence of any difference in hairstyle there, but oh well. You can sometimes see difference in age. You're not going to get exactly the same similarity value for two pictures of the same person. You're going to get some range of values if you take all the pairs of pictures of all the people on this call, let's say, but they're going to be centered at some relatively high similarity score. And then if you have pairs of pictures that belong to different people, they're going to come out not quite as similar, and they're going to be centered around some lower value. That's Domingo and I, and Claudio and I, and Domingo and Claudio. And so you've got this distribution of what we call imposter scores, that is two different people, and this distribution of what we call genuine scores, that is two pictures of the same person. And you end up having to put a threshold between the two distributions. A value of similarity above the threshold, you say, well, that must be two images of the same person. A value of similarity below the threshold, you say, well, that shouldn't be two images of the same person. Every face recognition system, every biometric system will always have the possibility of making either one of two kinds of errors. There will occasionally be something in the imposter distribution that's above the threshold that the system uses, that is two pictures of two different people, but the similarity, for whatever reason, they have specular highlights on their forehead and the same big goofy smile, and they come out with a high similarity value, and you say that they match when in fact they don't. A false match decision. On the other side, occasionally you'll have two pictures of the same person. Maybe they've changed their facial expression, changed their hairstyle. If it's a woman, maybe they're heavy makeup of one type and of a different type or something like that, and they'll get a low similarity, and it'll be below the threshold, and you'll have a false non-match. So always the possibility of a false non-match and a false match. You can play with the threshold and minimize one at the cost of increasing the other. And that's sort of how face recognition at the high level works. Our government got interested back in the early 1990s as face recognition began to move from more of an academic research topic into a technology that looked like it was having enough promise that it might be usable. This is the error rate here on the vertical axis. These are the dates of government evaluations of face recognition technology in the US. US government evaluations of technology around the world, actually, would be a better way of saying it. You can see the error rate plummets, right? Dropping substantially every 3, 4, 5 years to the point where somewhere around 2009, 10, the people running these evaluations decide, you know, we can move to a harder version of the problem and a larger data set to sort of put the error rate back up to where we can do some interesting experiments. And you can see that heading down. And somewhere around here, 2017, 18, 19, deep neural network style face recognition became the predominant way of doing things. The particular technology that's probably the best known at the moment is called ArcFace, and it comes out of Imperial College in London. So it sort of blew a lot of the commercial applications out of the water when it first came out. So when you ask how has face recognition technology changed, you know, over 20, 25 years, the error rate has plummeted. The problem got reset to be harder and the error rate has plummeted again. So whatever you knew about what you thought face recognition could do for you 5 years ago is out of date. And we're all expecting we have at least one more cycle of that sort of dramatic improvement in what face recognition technology can do.
So it has become much more effective. It's got greater accuracy. The error rates have gone down substantially. So that's made it go from something that people play around with in the lab to things that people actually use in the real world, right? So where is it being used? How are people putting this into play? I know that an iPhone has face recognition on it. You can unlock your phone with your face. Where else is it in play?
Well, so face recognition technology is happening everywhere, it seems like, and there's startups all over the place that are doing different sorts of things. I want to highlight just maybe three kinds of applications here. And this one I picked out because I think it's morally unambiguously or ethically unambiguously a good thing. Drowsy drivers are the result, cause a certain number of accidents every year.
Mm-hmm.
There's technology that goes in some high-end cars now where the cameras are watching the head of the driver, looking for the eyes being open and not the eyelids being droopy, and for the gaze going in the direction where the car is going, and will alert the driver if the driver seems to be falling asleep at the wheel, right? So this is face image analysis type algorithms. You can probably go on Amazon and get an aftermarket sort of piece of technology like this for your car today, and some new car models come with this kind of thing. So that's a kind of technology that goes on. A more recognition-oriented technology, and I pulled this out. It has Rite Aid in the title. I apologize if anybody is personally invested in Rite Aid. This is a use that happens throughout the retail industry. You have surveillance cameras that are watching people as they come into the store. If there's been an incident of shoplifting, someone in the store can go back to the surveillance camera and say, yeah, that's the person. Enter that person into our database so that in the future, if that same person comes back to the store, I can get an alert and it's a returning shoplifter, right? Rite Aid had some negative publicity, I think claims to now to have abandoned the use of this technology, but you can see the motivation from the storekeeper. The ethically difficult problem, the kind of thing that the Tech Ethics Center here at Notre Dame would want to think about is, well, wait a minute, what is the standard for what people walking into a store that's doing this should know about what's being done? What ability should they have to have their images taken out? What's the process when, as we know, false matches and false non-matches occur? How are those going to be treated? And this sort of question for private uses of face recognition technology has come up and been addressed in some state legislatures. The state of Illinois has something called BIPA, Biometric Information Privacy Act, which is, to my thinking, a little bit of an extreme version of the Information Privacy Acts that various states are putting together. Damages under BIPA can be $1,000 for each negligent violation. So the law asks that the people running face recognition or any biometric technology have a written policy for how long they're going to keep the data and get written consent. So a Rite Aid in Illinois, every time somebody walks through the door and has their face image taken and compared against the database to determine whether or not they might be a shoplifter, every single time is a $1,000 statutory violation. Every day the store is open. You can imagine if you were doing that in the state of Illinois, that the potential liability becomes enormous, right? And could put smaller businesses out of business from a class action lawsuit of everybody who walks in wanting $1,000 for every time they've walked in the store. Right. And so another question is, should we have these sorts of laws? Should they be national rather than varying state by state? How are we going to adapt to the use of face recognition technology by all of the different commercial concerns that go on? And coming to kind of the other endpoint, an example of a face recognition technology that's unambiguous, but unambiguous in a negative way. The central government in China is using face recognition. You can look at the face image and predict gender, and you can predict race, and they're looking for Uyghurs. There's an ethnic minority that lives in a Western province in China, And simply the fact that the system recognizes you as a Uyghur will put an alert in, and you'll be tracked everywhere you go. So the central government able to track an ethnic minority throughout the country. I still believe that in the United States, we would consider this beyond the pale ethically. So those are some examples of vastly different kinds of things that are going on with face image analysis technology.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize that we kind of have both the ends of the spectrum. The fact that we can keep people from falling asleep while they're driving on the freeway versus actively oppressing a minority within our country. Those are two extremes. One is on the good end of the scale and one is on the very bad end of the scale. But there are technical issues in facial recognition, right? There are biases that creep in, and this is part of the work you guys have been doing, is that you're looking at this bias, right?
Yes, we've been looking at this topic for, I guess, 3 years now under federal government support. And one of the motivating things that's for our work is this idea that showed up in the media multiple times, that face recognition technology is less accurate the darker your skin tone. That's the wording, the premise that shows up. This is a BBC article, this is a New York Times article, say essentially the same thing. It's almost like the reporters were all in some meeting where they got an idea of how the technology works and wrote similar sorts of stories about it. We've actually published some work that concludes that there is no good evidence for this statement as it's phrased. We thought hard about how to word that result, how to publish that paper, and we came down on the position that it was correct to disagree, and that the right way to disagree would be to make sure that the software artifacts that we used in our research and the image database we used in our research were ones generally available to the research community. So in principle, anybody who disagreed with us could redo our work themselves to find our error if we've made one, or do a different analysis if they think we looked at it incorrectly. And we think that's a kind of an ethical standard for this type of research. So even though we're going to disagree with this common media premise, we do recognize that there are incidents that happen that are something like the tagline on the first slide today, when the algorithm works perfectly, but the situation is a failure. So this is a recent incident that happened in Michigan. This gentleman, Robert Williams, was arrested and held for a day for theft. And then eventually the prosecutor dropped all charges, apologized, and said there was no evidence for him to have been arrested to begin with. How did that happen? Well, if you look around online, you can find the Michigan State Police report of an example of using face recognition. So this is a surveillance image here of the person who stole a watch in a store in Detroit, a high-end watch, so a couple $1,000 watch, a very expensive watch. The Metro Detroit police gave this probe image to the Michigan State Police to do a face recognition search. The algorithm said, okay, I'm going to take the face part of this image, and you can tell that's not a great quality image, and I'm going to run the face from this image against all of the faces in the Michigan State Police database, and the algorithm can then report to you, well, this one's as close as I've got, right? And it came out with this person as the closest it could find in the data that it had to the image you gave it. That's what the algorithm is supposed to do. The people who run the Michigan State Police face recognition service produced this investigative lead report, and they have it correctly identified at the top. This document is not a positive identification. We're not telling you that this person is this person. It is an investigative lead only and is not probable cause to arrest. To repeat, further investigation is needed to develop probable cause to arrest. When I tell you what the additional investigation is, you're going to be appalled, I think, I hope. The police involved took this picture of the surveillance and this picture and took them to a security person at the store who was not working on the day when the incident happened, and so is not an eyewitness to anything, and asked in some manner that's not recorded and not available to us, do you think these people look the same? The security guy said yes, so they went out and arrested this gentleman, and it took him a couple of days to unwind things, get out of jail, and eventually have the charges dropped. So this was a failure of the police system use of face recognition technology. I don't think it was in the algorithm. I don't think it was at the Michigan State level. I think it was somehow in the Metro Detroit police officers not reading or not understanding what the header meant on this sort of report. But we know that those sorts of things happen. And so the bigger tech ethics issue is how, when we give this technology to people to be used in the real world in a large system sense by people at different levels of training, how do we build in as many safeguards as we can that sort of guide people, push people, nudge people towards appropriate use of technology, and maybe automatically monitor instances where technology might not be used appropriately. So we are going deeper into this. I have this slide here to remind myself that I did not do all this work. I did almost none of this work, but I do talk about this work. This is my colleague, Michael King, who spent considerable time working for the federal government inside the intelligence community, a couple of PhD students at Florida Institute of Technology, and a PhD student here at Notre Dame. We are the group doing some of the work, doing the work that I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides. Where exactly is the bias in face recognition, and what is it like? Well, this is comparing the imposter distribution. That's the distribution of all scores of two images of different people for Caucasian males in blue and Caucasian females in red. You notice that they're not the same. Ideally, they would be lying right on top of each other. But this red curve runs outside to higher similarity values than the blue curve. The way to read that, interpret that, is to say that on average for this face recognition algorithm and this database, images of two different women look more similar on average than images of two different men.
Wow.
That's what it means for this red curve to run outside.
Mm-hmm.
This is the genuine distribution, the blue one for men, the red one for women. Again, we would like for them, the world would be simpler if the two distributions were the same. The red distribution in this case is running to lower similarity values. The way to interpret this is that for this algorithm and this database, two different images of the same woman on average look less alike to the algorithm than two different images of the same man. So women, for any fixed threshold here, would have a higher false match rate. They would be more likely than a man to be accidentally taken to be someone else, and they would have a higher false non-match rate. That is, when trying to get into their bank account or whatever with their face, or trying to match their passport to at the airport, they would have a higher chance of being a false non-match.
Wow.
So women lose on both error rates.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the analogous set of curves for males, African-American and Caucasian. You can see that the blue curve is running out here. That's meaning that African-American males have potentially a higher false match rate. But when you look over here, the blue curve is running again to higher similarity values. That means that Caucasian males have a higher false non-match rate. So for Mike King and I, Mike would have a higher chance of a false match than I, but I would have a higher chance of a false non-match than him. The really interesting thing here, this D prime statistic is just telling us how far apart these distributions are. The distance between the red imposter and genuine, the distance between the blue imposter and genuine. The face recognition system actually has greater power to separate, recognize African-American males than it does Caucasian males. It's kind of the opposite conclusion of what you might get from the headlines. So this is the sort of result that we're putting in the technical literature and trying to do it in a way that it stays reproducible and that we can explain it, hopefully, to broad audiences. The million-dollar question, the invaluable question is why? Why do we have this relationship for race and this relationship for gender between the accuracies? Nobody knows. The short answer for the moment is that nobody knows. Is it a flawed algorithm in some way? Is the training data, which sort of creates the algorithm when you're using deep neural networks within a framework, is the training data flawed in some way? We have some evidence that says that it's probably not flawed in the way you think it might be. Are you doing image acquisition in the wrong way? Are you doing image acquisition in some way that disadvantages one gender rather than the other, one race rather than the other? Are the biological differences the cause? Women on average have smaller skull sizes than men. If the same number of pixels are in the image, there's less information on less pixels in the image on the woman's face than the man's. We don't know. Different social patterns. Women have different hairstyles than men. Women have more, for all the men in the audience, you could put in the chat stream, how many different styles of makeup have you worn in the last week? Right? And for all the women, how many different styles have you worn in the last week? Well, in our society, women tend to have multiple different, artificially different appearances. Men tend to have fewer. So that's a different social pattern. Is that the cause of some part of this? And we're in the early middle of beginning to nail some of this down. It's looking more like biology and social pattern and less like algorithm training data and image acquisition. Though when you want to solve the problem, you might come back to this side to solve problems that originate on this side. That's all work that we're going to look at in the future.
So just briefly, Kevin, you mentioned training data, and I know that this is something that you're familiar with. Where is the training data coming from a lot of these algorithms? Where are people actually getting these pictures that they're using to train the algorithms? So
the fashion currently, for the last 10 years or so, has been that, well, there's a lot of social media. We can go out on the web and we can scrape the web, is the phrase, and find imagery that's in the wild. That is, images that people have posted on various social media sites. And so you can find a data set that's available for free online where either a university or a company has harvested data from the web, multiple images of each of a million different people, right? Wow. Now, these images, I've looked at some of them, probably more than some of the people who collected them. The images are highly varying quality. When you post things on a social media site, there's some amount of image compression. There might be some amount of image brightening or changes to make it a more appealing image. Sometimes there's annotations that have been put on it. So the image quality is highly variable, but you can obtain data sets of millions of images representing hundreds of thousands to millions of people and create your data set. You yourself could do that at home this weekend. Companies like Google, Facebook, Baidu in China, or the Chinese government probably have tens to hundreds of millions of images of tens to hundreds of millions of people to use as training data to create their deep neural network algorithm.
So is it likely that some of us are actually in these databases and that our faces are being used to train these?
I would say it's almost certain that you are in some database which is not made public. If you're a celebrity at all, and in fact, being faculty and being speakers at a number of conferences, we probably qualify to be in the celebrity category. Our images might have been harvested and being given out by somebody else. But in general, if you've put images on any social media site, you should assume that some corporations and some governments have copies of them and are using them for their own purposes without you knowing and without you being able to do anything about it.
Wow. So before we turn to the Q&A, and again, just a reminder for our audience, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A form. We'll take those in just a second. What is Notre Dame doing in terms of this kind of work? And are there things that we should talk about in terms of trying to address these issues?
Well, the Tech Ethics Center and Tech Ethics Lab on campus sort of exists to not to solve this particular problem, but a whole family of problems, and this sort of is one example of the space that those organizations cover. For myself, my research group, we're trying to figure out why are there different accuracies for young people, old people, males, females, different races, and what could we do? What technology could we provide, say, the Metro Detroit Police, to put in place and to be able to promise constituents that two different groups of people will get equal service from technology, right?
Yeah.
Technology in the service of all people equally.
Gotcha. Yeah. So we are getting down to the end of the hour, but I do want to take some questions from the audience. So we've got one that comes from Ryan. How does facial recognition avoid becoming a form of phrenology when facial recognition is used beyond biometrics? So phrenology was
Yes.
the measure of heads that had this great promise back at the beginning of the last century, I think.
I wish I had another half hour. We've got a great paper for you, Ryan. It's called The Criminality from Face Illusion. There are researchers who have published papers in the peer-reviewed literature, a Springer journal, and Springer is considered a reputable publisher, saying, I can take your face image and predict whether or not you're criminal. Myself, Mike King, and Walter Shire here at Notre Dame have written a response to this to claim that this is pure illusion. You can't label the data to train anything. The data sets you've used don't mean what you think you mean. We're saying this to the developers. In the United States, a mugshot is not proof you're a criminal, it's proof you were arrested. Many non-criminal persons are arrested for various reasons. You might go out and protest on election day and get arrested if you're standing in the wrong place, but you're not a criminal in that sense. It's a very dangerous idea. The idea that you can predict from someone's face image whether or not they're a criminal. Governments could waste money on it. People could be hurt by it. There's another strain of research predicting sexual orientation from a face image. So there are, you put this sort of sophisticated technology into the public domain, it essentially is now, people will come up with crazy ideas and attempt them. So we avoid it by calling it what we believe it is, demonstrating that it is that way, and if you see the paper, showing how they could have corrected their work before they got into the peer-reviewed literature, got embarrassed.
Yeah, that again is one of the things that we are trying to do is we're trying to illuminate some of these issues and talk a little bit about why we should be careful about the conclusions we make with this. One more question here. How much do things like age, facial hair, injury, and plastic surgery affect facial recognition? Does someone's data need to be regularly updated to reflect these changes?
Yes, to maintain optimal accuracy, your picture probably, I was going to say 3 or 4, you should have updated a face image 3 or 4 years. It's probably more like 10 years now, because there's been concentrated effort on trying to figure out what are the elements of the face that are most persistent over time. But we all know that our face changes over time. So yes, the accuracy will degrade for the longer age difference there is between the two pictures you're trying to match. And for younger people, it will change dramatically over mid-teens to mid-20s, right? So in that time period, lots of change, stable for a while, and then more change. These are patterns that are understood at the high level, but individuals can age at very different rates. And so it's hard to come up with a one size fits all or one size fits all persons, one aging pattern fits all persons sort of solution to this.
Gotcha. So, and I think we're thinking about in that question, if we are trying to use this for a good use, so for me trying to get into my phone or trying to access my bank account or something like that, I want to keep it updated so that I get a positive result as opposed to a false negative.
Oh, and you would like to know if it's a missing child. It's been 10 years since they went missing. What are they likely to look like now? And so there's been a lot of work trying to figure out, okay, what's the face appearance I should search for now if I want to find this person who's been missing for 10 years.
Right. I think we have time for just one more question, if we can go through this quickly. If US-based companies exit from the facial recognition technology, does that leave the field open to companies based in less ethical or law-based countries?
Face recognition technology is available. I mean, you don't have to be a government. You could be just a tech person. You could download the source code for ArcFace. You could download a set of images for whoever you wanted to go after and tune ArcFace towards that population of people. So there's no way of controlling the use of face recognition technology by its availability. It's going to have to be by government policies. Not all US companies have left the market, and certainly China is, not to single out China, they're not necessarily the only one, but they're most in the news for being willing to provide face recognition technology to governments that might be more likely to use it for things that we would not approve of than US companies would be. So are they going to end up controlling the future of the technology? I don't believe so, but anybody we don't supply it to is going to get it from them.
Right. Well, Kevin, thank you. We are getting down to the end of the hour, and I have to be sensitive for everyone's time. And I know you've got another meeting at 1 that you're going to have to jump to. But I want to thank you, and I want to thank Provost Miranda for her